Han Byung-sak, the coldest boss in Seoul's underworld, decides to test the loyalty of his contract wife by allowing his manipulative family to offer her an impossible choice. While the world assumes Tamika J is just another opportunistic parasite clinging to his power, her response to a $5 billion bribe leaves the ruthless legend gasping for air. This single moment of truth shatters Byung-sak's engagement to his own legacy, ignites a violent internal war within his clan, and forces a man who swallows the light to choose between his hollow empire and the only woman who truly sees the man beneath the tattoos. The story begins in a rain-slicked penthouse 40 floors above Seoul, where Han Byung-sak stands alone, feeling the suffocating weight of an inheritance that demands he remain a monster. Engaged to his empire and bound by a contract marriage to Tamika J, he has spent months treating their union as a cold business transaction. His advisor warns him that ruling an empire without a soul is a slow death, and that his predecessors died surrounded by power but devoid of love. After realizing his own family is plotting to use Tamika as a pawn to control him, Byung-sak decides to let the trap spring, offering Tamika the ultimate exit to see if her reckless fearlessness was a mask for greed, or if she is the only person in his life who isn't for sale. The air inside the Iron Rose was a thick soup of expensive cologne, cigarette smoke, and the heavy, rhythmic throb of techno that felt like a secondary heartbeat. It was the playground of Seoul's glittering elite, a place where fortunes were laundered between sips of vintage cristal. At the center of the VIP lounge sat Han Byung-sak. He was a shadow made flesh, his massive, imposing frame draped in a custom-tailored black suit that seemed to swallow the neon light. The intricate tattoos on his neck, vines of ink that disappeared into his collar, marked him as a man who lived outside the law of ordinary men. He was surrounded by a fortress of guards, their eyes scanning the room like predatory birds. No one approached the king. No one even dared to look him directly in the eye. Until Tamika J stepped out of the crowd. She moved with a reckless fearlessness that made the music seem to fade. Dressed in a sleek black leather jacket that caught the strobe lights, she didn't look like the desperate woman she was, a woman whose family debt had just been sold to the most dangerous syndicate in the city. To the onlookers, she was a provocateur. To herself, she was a woman with nothing left to lose. The guards stepped forward, their hands moving toward their waistbands, but Byung-sak raised a single gold-ringed finger. He was intrigued. His dangerous, pretty eyes tracked her as she bridged the gap that no one else dared to cross. Tamika didn't stop until she was inches away. She could feel the heat radiating from him, a physical pressure that would have made a weaker person tremble. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in, her sleek ponytail catching the light, and placed her hand directly on his chest. Through the fine silk of his shirt, she felt the steady, terrifyingly calm thrum of his heart. The room went silent. The socialites froze, their faces blurred by shock and disbelief. A woman of African descent was claiming the space of a man who ruled with iron and ink. "They say you're the one who buys the unbuyable," Tamika whispered, her voice a sharp, elegant blade that cut through the bass. "I have a debt that needs a new owner, and I hear you need a wife to keep your throne." Byung-sak didn't move, but his unreading expression shifted. For the first time in 6 months of feeling nothing, a spark of possessive intensity flared in his gaze. He reached up, his large tattooed hand covering hers, pinning it to his chest. He liked the way she looked at him, not as a monster to be feared, but as a solution to be managed. "You're playing a dangerous game, little bird," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not playing," she countered. "I'm negotiating." The coldest boss leaned back, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. The club was full of people, but in that moment, she was the only one he truly saw. The claim had been made. The silence in Byung-sak's private study was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Outside, the rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the penthouse, mirroring the storm brewing within the room's dark mahogany walls. Byung-sak sat behind a desk carved from obsidian, the light from a single designer lamp catching the intricate tattoos on his throat. He looked less like a man and more like a god of the underworld presiding over a soul's final judgment. Tamika stood across from him, her black leather jacket still damp from the trek through the club's back exit. She watched as his gold ring caught the light while he slid a thick, cream-colored document across the desk. $50 million, Byung-sok said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in the small space. That is the price the syndicate placed on your family's head. I've already wired the funds. Your debt is no longer with them. It is with me. Tamika didn't reach for the paper immediately. She kept her gaze locked on his dangerous, pretty eyes, searching for the catch. And what does the king want in exchange for $50 million? 1 year, he replied, leaning back into his leather chair, his massive frame dominating the room. My grandfather's will is specific. To inherit the chairmanship of the Han Group, I must be a married man, stable, domesticated. He spat the last word as if it were poison. I need a wife who doesn't fear the sight of blood and won't ask questions when I come home at dawn. You proved your recklessness in the club. You'll do. Tamika finally picked up the pen. The weight of the contract felt like a lead shackle, but the alternative was a shallow grave in the outskirts of the city. As she scanned the clauses, she realized this wasn't a marriage, it was a ceasefire. There are rules, Tamika. Byung-sok stepped around the desk, his presence swallowing the light as he stood inches from her. He smelled of rain, expensive tobacco, and a coldness that went bone deep. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a ghost of a whisper near her ear. This is a business transaction, nothing more. Don't touch me unless we are in public. Don't look for the man behind the mask. And above all, he paused, his expression shifting into something lethal and unreadable. Don't love me. I have no room in my life for something that soft. You are a shield, not a partner. Tamika felt the chill of his words, but she met his gaze with a defiant tilt of her chin. $50 million says I can follow the rules, boss. Just make sure you can follow them too. She signed her name in bold, sweeping strokes. The ink was barely dry before Byung-sok took the pen from her hand, his fingers briefly brushing hers. A spark of tension, sharp and unwanted, flared between them. A silent warning that in a house built on secrets, the hardest rule to keep would be the one involving the heart. The transition into Han Byung-suk's world felt less like a move and more like an annexation. 2 days after the contract was signed, a fleet of black SUVs arrived at Tamika's cramped apartment, their idling engines humming like a warning. By sunset, she was standing in the center of the fortress penthouse, her meager belongings looking like relics in a temple of glass, steel, and cold ambition. The penthouse was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation. Every surface was polished to a lethal shine, reflecting the city lights like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Byung-sok didn't offer a tour. He simply pointed toward the sprawling master wing and then to the separate guest suite on the opposite side of the gallery. Your space is there, he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. My staff will provide whatever you need. Just remember, the cameras are everywhere. Outside these walls, you are my obsession. Inside, you are a ghost. The true test of their business deal came 48 hours later at the Han Group's charity gala. It was the first time the Coldest boss would reveal his bride to the world. The double doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and the air seemed to leave the room. Byung-sok entered, his massive, imposing frame draped in a velvet tuxedo, his ink-covered hand resting possessively on the small of Tamika's back. She was a vision of high-contrast elegance in a floor-to-length gown of shimmering silver, her dark skin glowing against the cool metal of her jewelry. The glittering elite froze. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. The orchestra's rhythm faltered. The shock was a physical heat radiating from the crowd as they took in the sight of the ruthless mafia king with a black woman on her arm. The whispers started instantly, a hissed chorus of disbeliefs and judgment. They had expected a Korean heiress, a merger of bloodlines. Instead, they saw a woman who stood with reckless fearlessness, her chin tilted up as if she was the one who owned the room. Who is she? A prominent socialite hissed, her face a blurred mask of disdain. A commoner? A foreigner? Byung-sok didn't flinch. His dangerous, pretty eyes swept the room with a lethal intensity that silenced the nearest critics. He leaned down, his lips brushing Tamika's ear in a performance of intimate devotion that sent a shiver down her spine. They're waiting for you to fail, little bird, he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. They want to see you break under the weight of their stares. Tamika turned her head just enough to meet his gaze, her hand moving to his chest, mirroring their first encounter in the club. Then they're going to be disappointed, boss. I've spent my whole life being exactly what people didn't expect. For a fleeting second, the unreadable expression on Byung-sok's face cracked, revealing a flicker of dark, genuine admiration. He had bought a shield, but as he led her into the sea of vipers, He realized he might have actually found a queen. The weeks following the gala were a test of endurance. Inside the penthouse, the silence was no longer empty. It was heavy, charged with the friction of two people trying to remain ghosts while sharing the same air. Byung-sok remained a shadow, disappearing into the city's underbelly and returning in the gray hours of the morning, his massive frame radiating a cold, metallic exhaustion. One Tuesday, the rain had finally ceased, leaving the city below shimmering like a bruised jewel. Tamika found him on the balcony, his dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, staring at the horizon with a calculated focus that looked more like morning. As she approached with a tray of tea, the moonlight caught a detail she had noticed but never dared to address. A small, precise tattoo of an old-fashioned skeleton key tucked just behind his right ear, nestled against a thin, jagged scar that disappeared into his hairline. "That's not like the others," Tamika murmured, setting the tray down. She didn't stay back this time. She leaned against the railing, her reckless fearlessness pushing her into his personal space. "The vines on your neck are a warning. The ink on your arms is a history. But the key? That looks like a secret." Byung-sok didn't pull away. He didn't even turn his head, but she saw his jaw tighten, the floral-like pattern on his throat shifting with the movement. For a long minute, the only sound was the distant hum of the city. "It was the only thing my mother left," he finally said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sounded uncharacteristically raw. He reached up, his large gold ring glinting as he traced the scar behind his ear. "She didn't have money or land to give me when the clan took her away. She gave me a literal key, told me it opened a box hidden in the floorboards of our old house in the slums. It held her journals, the only proof that I was born from love, not just a bloodline." He turned then, his dangerous, pretty eyes clouded with a rare, shattering vulnerability. "The scar is from the night my father found me reading them. He burned the books and tried to cut the memory out of me. He said a king doesn't need a past. He only needs a future built on fear." Tamika felt a sharp, unexpected ache in her chest. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ink. "He was wrong," she whispered. "The key is still there. He couldn't take the part of you that knows how to feel." Byung-sok froze at her touch, his unreadable expression fracturing. For the first time, he didn't command her to stay back. He leaned into her hand, a man who swallows the light, finally seeking warmth. In that moment, the contract felt like a lie. She wasn't just a shield anymore. She was the only one who had been given the key to the man behind the monster. The penthouse was a cathedral of shadows at 4 a.m., the floor-to-ceiling glass offering a panoramic view of a city that never realized its king was drowning. Tamika was pulled from sleep not by a sound, but by the absence of one. The rhythmic humming of the building's ventilation suddenly punctuated by a low, guttural choke coming from the master wing. She didn't hesitate. Her reckless fearlessness led her through the darkened gallery toward Byung-sok's bedroom. The door was ajar, and inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of cold sweat and ozone. On the sprawling bed, the massive, imposing frame of Han Byung-sok was twisted in the silk sheets, his body rigid as if bracing for an impact. "No," he rasped, his voice a jagged shadow of his usual melodic rumble. "Not the boy. Leave the boy." His ink-covered hands were clawing at the air, his fingers twitching toward the nightstand where a sleek black handgun rested. The dangerous pretty eyes were squeezed shut, the floral-like pattern on his throat straining as he fought a ghost that Tamika couldn't see. Every guard in his employ knew the rule: never wake the boss while he's dreaming. To touch him was to trigger a lethal muscle memory response that usually ended with a barrel pressed against a forehead. But Tamika didn't reach for a weapon. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the moonlight catching her sleek ponytail as she reached out. "Byung-sok," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the dark. He bolted upright, his movement a violent blur. In a heartbeat, his hand was wrapped around her throat, pinning her back against the pillows. His eyes snapped open, but they weren't seeing the penthouse. They were seeing a rain-slicked alleyway from a decade ago. Tamika didn't struggle. She didn't gasp for air. She simply placed her hand over the key tattoo behind his ear, her thumb grazing the scar. "It's me," she breathed, her gaze unflinching. "You're in the fortress. You're safe." The recognition hit him like a physical blow.
The murderous tension in his arm shattered, and he collapsed forward, burying his face in the crook of her neck. His breathing was ragged, his massive chest heaving against hers. For a long minute, the most feared man in Seoul simply clung to her, his fingers digging into the fabric of her silk robe, as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling back into the abyss. "I saw them," he choked out, his voice vibrating against her skin. "They don't stay dead in the dark." Tamika wrapped her arms around him, pulling the coldest boss into a cocoon of warmth. She didn't ask for details, she just held him, realizing that the contract had protected her from death, but she was the only one protecting him from himself. The man who swallowed the light was finally letting someone else hold the torch.
The Grand Opera House was a cathedral of gold leaf and treachery, filled with the same glittering elite who had spent months waiting for Tamika to stumble. Beside her, Han Byung-suk was a pillar of lethal elegance, his massive, imposing frame cutting a sharp silhouette in a midnight blue tuxedo. His hand remained firm on the small of her back, but Tamika felt the microscopic shift in his posture, the calculated focus that preceded a storm. "Stay close," he murmured, his dangerous pretty eyes tracking a waiter whose gait was too heavy for a tray of champagne. The air shattered a second later. A chandelier didn't fall. Instead, the lights cut to a visceral, high-contrast darkness, and the rhythmic pop of suppressed gunfire replaced the orchestra's swell. The crowd screamed, a panicked tide of silk and diamonds. But Byung-suk moved with the precision of a predator. He shoved Tamika toward the marble columns, reaching for the weapon concealed at his hip. "Ryu!" he roared, signaling his head of security. But the ambush was coordinated. 3 shadows emerged from the velvet curtains of the VIP boxes, their muzzles flashing in the dark. Byung-suk fired back, but a second shooter had the angle on his blind side, the side where the key tattoo marked his vulnerability. He was focused on the primary threat, unaware of the steel barrel leveling at his temple from the shadows of the mezzanine. Tamika didn't scream. Her reckless fearlessness surged, turning her fear into a cold, sharp blade. She didn't have a gun, but she had the heavy crystal centerpiece from the gala table. With a strength born of pure desperation, she hurled the glass at the mezzanine shooter, the impact catching the man's arm just as he pulled the trigger. The bullet whistled past Byung-suk's ear, grazing the marble instead of his skull. In the heartbeat of silence that followed, Tamika didn't retreat. She lunged forward, grabbing a discarded heavy tray and using it as a shield to shove Byung-suk toward the service exit. "Left! Move left!" she commanded, her voice an elegant authority that even the coldest boss obeyed. Byung-suk pivoted, his ink-covered hand catching the second shooter in the throat. As his guards finally swarmed the room, neutralizing the remaining threats, the silence that returned was deafening. He stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on Tamika. She was breathing hard, her silver gown stained with dust, her hands still clutching the edge of the service door. "You didn't run," he breathed, his voice a low, melodic rumble of disbelief. "I'm your wife, Byung-suk," she countered, stepping back into his light. "I don't run from the things I've claimed." The socialites watched from the floor, their shock no longer about her race or her status, but about the provocateur who had just saved the king. Byung-suk reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a possessive intensity that had nothing to do with the contract. She wasn't his victim. She was his partner. The aftermath of the assassination attempt left the penthouse feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a besieged bunker. While Byung-suk was away, purging the city of the traitors who had dared to strike at the opera house, a different kind of predator slipped through the gates. Tamika was summoned to the formal tea room, where the air was cold enough to frost the glass. Waiting for her were the Han family elders, 3 men whose faces were as dry and withered as ancient parchment, their eyes lacking even a flicker of the dangerous pretty light that burned in Byung-suk. They didn't see a partner. They saw a stain on the family legacy. "We will be brief, Miss J," the oldest member rasped, sliding a sleek black checkbook across the table. On the top leaf, a number was written with clinical precision: $5 billion. The contract was a necessary deception to secure the inheritance. But the game has become too dangerous. Byung-suk is distracted, and a distracted king is a dead one. Tamika stared at the staggering amount of zeros, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was more than a bribe. It was an entire future, a way to vanish forever.
"I didn't sign the contract for money," she said, her voice steady despite the predatory silence of the room. "Everyone has a price," the elder countered, his voice dropping to a low, serrated hiss. He signaled to an attendant, who placed a tablet on the table. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy, live feed of a small grocery store in a quiet neighborhood. Tamika's breath hitched. It was her aunt's shop. A black sedan was idling at the curb, and two men in heavy coats stood by the entrance. "Your aunt is a hard-working woman," the elder continued, his expression unreadable and cruel. "It would be a tragedy if her debt was suddenly recalled by less patient men than our nephew. Take the $5 billion, sign the annulment papers, and leave Korea tonight. Your aunt will be safe, her shop will be paid off, and you will be the wealthiest woman in your country. If you stay, we cannot guarantee that Byung-suk can protect both his throne and your family." The temptation was a jagged blade at her throat. This was the exit clause she had never asked for. Her reckless fearlessness was being pitted against her love for the only woman who had raised her. She looked at the check, then at the image of her aunt, unaware of the wolves at her door. The elders watched her, their faces masks of high-contrast arrogance. They expected her to fold, to be the gold digger they had always accused her of being. Tamika's fingers brushed the edge of the check, the paper feeling heavy with the weight of her aunt's life. The choice was a nightmare: save the man she was beginning to love, or save the family she couldn't afford to lose.
The penthouse was frozen in a high-contrast chill when Han Byung-suk returned. The scent of gunpowder and cold rain clung to his black coat, but the violence of the streets was nothing compared to the wreckage he found in the tea room. The three elders were gone, leaving behind only the ghost of their presence and a single rectangular slip of paper resting on the obsidian table. Byung-suk approached it like it was a live explosive. His dangerous, pretty eyes narrowed as he saw the staggering amount, $5 billion, and the blank annulment papers beside it. His ink-covered hand trembled as he picked up the check. The logic of his world was simple. Everyone had a price, and he had just seen the receipt for his own heart. "So they finally found it," he murmured, his voice a hollow, melodic rumble. "The number that's worth more than me." Tamika appeared in the doorway, her reckless fearlessness replaced by a haunting, silent exhaustion. She saw him holding the check, and the air in the room seemed to vanish. "Byung-suk, let me explain." "What is there to explain?" he snapped, turning to face her, his massive frame trembling with a raw, desperate energy. "They offered you a way out. They offered you safety for your aunt, and a life where you don't have to wash the blood off my sleeves. It's a perfect deal, Tamika. Even I would take it." He stepped toward her, his expression fracturing into something shattered and undone. He didn't scream or threaten. Instead, he thrust the check toward her. "Take it," he gasped, his voice cracking. "Take the money. Go to the airport. Save your family. But don't sign the papers because you want to leave. Sign them because I'm a monster who can't keep you safe." Tamika stared at him, stunned. "You're telling me to go?" "I'm begging you to take the gift," he whispered, his ink-covered fingers brushing her hand. "I realized today that I don't want a shield. I don't want a contract. I want you to be free. Take the $5 billion and stay because you choose to, not because you're a prisoner of my debt. But if you walk out that door with that money, I won't stop you. I never knew a man like me could feel this much pain, but I'd rather be alone in the dark than watch them use you to break me." The coldest boss in Seoul was no longer a king. He was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, offering his entire fortune just to hear her say that he was worth more than the gold. The noir shadows of the room closed in, leaving only the two of them caught in a moment of terrifying, absolute truth. The silence following Byung-suk's desperate plea was absolute, heavy with the weight of $5 billion and the life of a man who had forgotten how to breathe without a contract. Tamika looked at the check in his trembling, ink-covered hand, then up at his dangerous, pretty eyes, which were now stripped of their lethal focus. He was offering her the world, but all she saw was a man standing in the ruins of his own fortress, terrified that he was unlovable. Without a word, Tamika reached out. Her fingers brushed his, a spark of electricity grounding them both. But she didn't take the money to keep it. In one fluid, reckless motion, she gripped the edges of the check and tore it down the middle. The sound of the paper rending was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Byung-sok flinched, his massive frame jolting as the scraps of his family's bribe fluttered to the dark marble floor like useless confetti. "What are you doing?" he choked out, his voice a jagged, melodic rumble. "That was your family's safety, your freedom. You still don't get it, do you?" Tamika stepped into his space, her hand founding the floral-patterned ink on his throat, her thumb grazing the key tattoo behind his ear. "I didn't stay because of a debt, and I'm not leaving for a bribe. You think you're a monster, Byung-sok, but I'm the only one who actually sees you. I see the boy who kept his mother's journals. I see the man who holds me through my nightmares. I see the soul you've been trying to bury under all this ink." She looked him directly in the eye, her fearlessness burning brighter than the city lights behind them. "My aunt is safe because I already called Ryu. He's moved her to a secure location. Your elders have no leverage anymore. The only power in this room is what we decide to do next." Byung-sok's unreadable expression finally shattered, replaced by a raw, overwhelming relief that swallowed the dark. He collapsed into her, his face buried in the crook of her neck, his arms wrapping around her with a possessive intensity that finally felt like home. The coldest boss in Seoul let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension of a lifetime of war finally draining out of him. "I never knew," he whispered, his voice cracking against her skin. "I never knew I could be someone's choice." "You've always been mine," she murmured. 1 year later, the penthouse was no longer a fortress. It was a sanctuary. The glittering elite still whispered, but they did so with respect, watching as the Mafia King ruled not with a heart of stone, but with a clarity born of love. Byung-sok stood on the balcony, his dangerous pretty eyes clear, as he watched Tamika. The key behind his ear was no longer a secret of the past. It was the truth of his present. He had found his light, and he would never let the shadows touch it again.